I suggested this talk a while back at the PHP Romandie meetup group, where there was a talk about Symfony 4, which I really enjoyed. And I also noticed in the drinks afterwards that there was some interest to learn more about Laravel. Now, as you might know, the meetup was merged with the Webmardi, and since we couldn't find a date later last year, here we are today. So to this date, I still haven't figured out how to scroll my presenter notes, which is annoying, so I shouldn't write that much on a slide, so I'll improvise. To this date, I've worked on about 15 to 20 medium to large scale Laravel projects. I started to use it very, very early on, and I think thanks to my experiences and feedback from colleagues, I think I have a fairly good idea of what Laravel is good for and the things you should be careful about when using it in new projects. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We'll have a quick introductory part where I'll talk about the influences, the philosophy, and the rise in popularity of Laravel. And then I've picked a few topics. It's by no means exhaustive, but I've picked a few topics of interest to illustrate what I think is really cool about the framework and what's not so nice or what could be better. I'll try to be as constructive as possible. We'll see that some things could improve in future versions of Laravel. Others, due to the philosophy of the framework, could be more difficult to implement. We'll end with a little conclusion, some recommendations, a chance to ask questions, a quiz, and drinks which will be an opportunity to ask more questions and continue the discussion. So, first bit is about the influences, the philosophy, the rise in popularity. I think if you've opened Laravel's website, its goals are fairly clear in itself. It describes itself as a framework for web artisans, for people who like crafting code. So before we dive in, and so I can adapt the topic, I just wanted to get a rough idea of who in here considers themselves to be a PHP developer as part of their job. Raise your hand. Okay, the majority. Who has built at least one project with Laravel? Okay, about half, maybe 2/3. And who's currently working on one or more Laravel projects as part of their job? Okay, about 25% of the room. Okay, no, that's great. And I think I'll try to make this presentation interesting for everyone and to cater to everyone's knowledge, and hopefully in the discussions later on, those that know more will be able to share some experiences with those that know less or that are just getting started. So Laravel's philosophy is best described in an earlier version of the documentation that was in the Laravel 4 documentation site. I wasn't able to find it in the latest one. Laravel describes itself as aiming to make the development process a pleasing one for the developer without sacrificing application functionality. Happy developers make the best code. To this end, they've attempted to combine the very best of what they've seen in other frameworks, including Ruby on Rails, .NET, MVC, and Sinatra. This quote is from the author of Laravel, Taylor Otwell, because as we'll find out, he's quite a prolific developer. He's the driving force behind all of the Laravel ecosystem. He's now helped by some full-time employees, but the bulk of the work has been done by one single guy and his view on how things should be built. So we talked about the influences. We said that, okay, back in 2011, if I'm not mistaken, I think there wasn't anything really lightweight in PHP to just define a set of roots and map it to action handlers. And there were some frameworks, but there's nothing really convenient, nothing expressive, and nothing like Sinatra. I don't know if anyone has used Ruby the Ruby package called Sinatra to build simple APIs. I thought it was really cool and convenient to build simple services. So that's definitely influenced parts of Laravel, especially in the way routes are defined. Obviously, there's Ruby on Rails. Can't really see the logo here, but there, from Ruby on Rails, you got this this mindset of using conventions rather than configuring every part of the framework. And you also had this active record implementation, which greatly influenced Laravel's ORM, as we'll see later. And Taylor Otwell, being a .NET developer, was also influenced by parts of .NET MVC, to a minor extent, of course, but the MVC architecture, the templating language, they all have some kind of .NET heritage. In terms of the release history, the first version was released back in 2011. The first really serious and usable version was 3.1, and that's when I started to use it in some projects back in 2012. Version 4 was a big change in how the framework's modules were isolated and were based on Symfony components, and we'll come to that a bit later in the presentation. And in my case, well, I got involved with Laravel, well, simply because I wanted to use the elegant and beautiful language that is PHP. I'm joking. I actually had to port a Django application to run on a LAMP environment, and I wasn't really satisfied with the options at the time. There was Kohana, which was, does anyone remember Kohana? Or it was meant to be the successor to CodeIgniter. CodeIgniter, surely most people know of if they've been in the PHP community for long enough, but Laravel was really the one that clicked and that had everything, everything that I needed, and that's why I got involved. Back to the version history, we're now at, as part of version 5, you had this LTS.
Ask a very quick question.
Of course.
Were the decision to port Django to Laravel business related or technical related?
They were. So the question was, were the reasons for porting the Django application to PHP, were they business related or technical related? In this case, it was purely a technical limitation. The client could either run .NET, Java, or PHP, and PHP was the closest to my abilities back at the time. It wasn't driven by profound research. I would have stuck with Django probably, but
because what you described looked a lot like what I would think of Django with
We'll see. We'll see later. Actually, I could have mentioned it as part of the influences. It's not an influence that the creator of Laravel mentioned, as far as I know. I don't think he's touched or gone anywhere near Django, but surely, yes, some parts of the architecture are similar to what you would find in Django. So I was briefly talking about the LTS, sort of mirroring the guarantees that Symfony would provide, where you say you make this decision to bet on a framework, you want some kind of guarantee that it will be maintained and have security updates. And the LTS series, the 5.1 and 5.5, sort of catered to this need and gave some kinds of customers more security and confidence when choosing to bet on Laravel. And so since then, it's become hugely popular. I've included 3 metrics. You have daily installs on Packagist. We're at nearly 70,000. The highly accurate and original Google Trends. Everyone's doing this, but yeah, I just plotted the interest for Laravel, Ruby on Rails, and Symfony, and you can see that Laravel's overtaken Rails back in, I think, can't see on the graph, but probably in 2016, 2017. And also on GitHub at the beginning of this year, and if you take stars as a reliable metric for the quality of a product, of an open source project, then Laravel took the crown of the which bearing in mind that I excluded Vue.js, which also labeled itself as a framework, but I tried to only show the back-end frameworks here, and Laravel is definitely at the top. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that it was the right tool at the right time. You had this large population of PHP developers who were stuck with no proper dependency management, no good solutions to isolate and test code. And I think Symfony helped a lot to build and provide the foundations for this. And Laravel just reused a lot of those components, and we'll look at that later. It also had great documentation and a better than average effort to name and brand things consciously. We'll see every part of Laravel, every module has some kind of funky name, and it's not a technical name, but very often a name of that is, well, that sort of illustrates the purpose of the tools, so Socialite, Lumen, Horizon, and it's very far from the technical ones. And I think it was also partly due to the quality of some of the early documentation. I think you can find that in other projects. I think Django had a great Django book. Symfony has some good resources in the book, I believe. And Laravel had some really good content very early on. The books from Dale Reese and the resources on Laracasts definitely helped with that. And the bit that I should have shown first is this truly modern approach of using dependency management, of not reinventing every part of the framework. That was a fairly novel idea in the PHP world back then. But of course, there's also, there's also a fallacy, an appeal to numbers or popularity to say, okay, Laravel is great because a lot of people use it, and this is what I'll try to show in this presentation. I'll show you that perhaps the expectations of using a really popular project like Laravel are perhaps not entirely justified, and you expect something to be perfect and have every last bit thought out by the creator, and sadly that's not the case. And I could also talk about this difference between simple versus easy and the fact that they're not the same thing, but I'll spare you the Rich Hickey quotes. So let's start with the good. I think one of the parts that Laravel really nailed, like many other projects, once again, that have a decent CLI, well, Laravel with its installer makes it really easy to scaffold an entire project and include all dependencies. So if you run Laravel new in the name of your application, you'll see, obviously you'll have installed the global Laravel installer. We missed that bit. But you'll run this command, and then you'll see a whole bunch of dependencies. That's just the first page, and there's more coming on the next slide. But here already we can see a bunch of really interesting dependencies that are pulled in. We can see that a bunch of Symfony libraries, the routing, the HTTP foundation, the HTTP kernel, are included by default. You can also see there are some parts of Doctrine. There's Swift Mailer for mailing. There is Carbon for handling dates. So that's all part of Laravel's philosophy. If there's a good library in the PHP ecosystem, then let's just use it and not reinvent the wheel. And once again, we sort of take this for granted today. Well, at least I hope most people take this for granted. They'll first go and look on Packagist if there's a well-tested and well-documented package for this, but it didn't used to be that case. Maybe 10 years ago, you'd go on PHP classes or whatever dodgy website, download some part of code, but you wouldn't have the same kind of dependency management built in. There is a bunch, so we're now on the second page of dependency. There's a bunch of other things that are included. Great testing integration with obviously PHP unit. There's Prophecy from PHP spec. There are a bunch of libraries that are included and wired up make it easy to use them. So we also have some modules from the PHP League, the fly system to interact with local and remote file system, which are all really convenient and integrated really nicely in Laravel. And then the command completes and tells you, application ready, build something amazing. So in the next recording, don't worry, there will be some live coding. I'm sure you're all looking forward to this. Live coding is always a good idea. Yeah. So here we have a simple hello world, and I think we missed this. I'll replay it very quickly. So remember the Sinatra mindset, where you define your HTTP routes in a single file and define their handler in line. Well, this is what it looks like in Laravel. You just, here, instead of returning a view, we just return a string, hello Webmardi, and start the server with Laravel's command line, which we'll come back to in a minute. You open it, and there we go. Ooh, super impressive. So the CLI, the command I used earlier, PHP Artisan, that's where we come into the realm of cheesy names for Laravel components. Well, Artisan is the name of the CLI if you want to run any kind of command in Laravel. Actually, it's mostly a wrapper around the Symfony console component with a bunch of nicer, more friendly methods to format data or ask data from the user. By default, there's a bunch of commands that are all helpful in various situations. Tonight, we're really only going to look at a few. We'll start a local PHP development server with PHP Artisan serve. I'm sorry, the font is a little bit small, but that's serve. We will briefly interact with the application by starting a Sci shell with Tinker. We'll inspect the list of routes, and I forgot to highlight them, but we'll also use some of the generators, which are basically just ways of generating code in your application, just like you would in Symfony. For those of you who were at the PHP Romandie meetup, you'll find some similarities. The first one, it's really convenient, and the first topic I'll talk about is routing. So the first command I'll show is PHP Artisan root list. It's very often it's one of the first things you'll want to do when you start working on a new project. It's like getting a map, a complete map of your application. This is the default application, which is generated here. We have our simple root, which is just responding on slash, and you can see that it doesn't have any name. Its action is a closure, so a PHP closure anonymous function if you want, and you can also see the kinds of middlewares that are applied to every root, and that actually scales really well. Here's one application I worked on. I've heard there are much larger Laravel applications, but this one, you can't really read it here, but the font is a bit too small. But we have roughly 415 routes that are defined. And you could say maybe there's some repetition there, but the application is probably one of the best structured ones I've seen, and the repetition actually helps make sense of all the complex business logic that is captured in there. It's not the point isn't to show you what every detail there, but it's just to show you that this root list command is super helpful in showing you what kind of routes you have in your application, how you refer to them, if you want to do reverse routing, and what kind of middleware are applied to each one. And I talked about conventions earlier. So another PHP Artisan command that we use is the make controller in this case. And here you have the ability to generate a controller that will be by default RESTful and have all the respond to all methods that you would expect from the get, post, put, patch, delete, as well as some get handlers if you want to show a form to actually perform the action. The controller itself is simply registered with one line, and the various actions also contain some useful shortcuts, such as injecting the model directly. So whereas if you didn't have this kind of machinery in place, you would have in your talk controller, you would have to go and say, okay, I have this parameter ID, and I want to find the talk. In this case, the model we're interacting with is a talk. I'll have to find the talk with ID 1, etc. And in fact, since it's such a repetitive task to do this each time, Laravel is helping you. So if you type hint the model in the controller, we'll see the controller in its entirety in a while. But if you type hint the model in the controller action, you can simply access the object. And then another nice feature here. So I'm returning the talk instance, and Laravel in the HTTP response, in the way it deals with HTTP responses, will do the conversion to JSON. So if we take another simple example, in a routing file for APIs, you'll define, so here we're not returning an object, we're returning an array, but the inner workings are the same. And Laravel will actually make sure that the content type is set correctly. It will return valid JSON. And if you remember in the previous slide, we had this rate limiting API. Well, by default, you get all the headers there and all the validation. That is often tedious to implement if you build an API really from scratch. All these things are tricky to get right. And here you can really do it with a minimal amount of code. So yeah, I talked about this automatic JSON serialization. If you return an object or an array, then it will just be coerced to JSON as expected. We also briefly talked about reverse routing. So you have a route that is called home or about. But this route you don't want, or maybe in 6 months' time you want to rename it to About Us for SEO reasons. Well, the name will still be About, and all your named, since you have used a name to describe it and refer to it, you won't have to go and update it everywhere in your application. So this reverse routing is quite convenient. And you also have some mutators and accessors that's actually for Eloquent models that shouldn't be here. But you also have middleware, useful middleware like CSRF protection. That is just there by default. The next topic that I mostly like about Laravel is its ORM. Now we all know ORMs can be a double-edged sword, and on the one hand, they will make interacting with your database a really concise. It provides you a really concise API to interact with your database, but they also have their performance issues. There's sometimes a mismatch between what you have in the database and what your model actually represents. Your model might be out of date, but Laravel provides you. So this ORM called Eloquent, which has all of what you would expect in an ORM that implements active record, such as simple relationships, has many, belongs to many, but it also has a bit of extra that I haven't found in other solutions, such as polymorphic relationships. We'll see in the next slide what an example of such a polymorphic relationship. You also have ways to avoid the n+1 problem. So most people are familiar with this when you fetch a record and this record has associated records. So imagine you fetch a list of posts and they all have comments. you don't want to fetch the comments for every post and generate n requests plus the initial one you do. You do this by eager loading the relation, in this case comments, and you can all have it in 2 requests instead of n plus 1. So I think it wouldn't be interesting for you if I talked about the simple has many belongs to relationships. We'll still look at them. We'll still look at them in the code very briefly, but one part that I found really convenient is the handling of polymorphic relationships. And here we have a simple, I tried to come up with a very simple example where you have 2 tables that represent your entities. So you have talks and meetups. Talk belongs to a meetup, and both talks and meetups can have tags. Why not? You could say, okay, today's meetup has the tag PHP, Laravel, whatever, and the meetup group could be more generic. Webmardi could have the hashtag or the tag Romandie. And let's say these tags are all managed in one table, and you have to make this relationship between the 2. And one of the possible ways of doing that, instead of having a talks tag and a meetups tag, is to have a generic taggables table, and this will make sure that the mapping is done with the taggable ID and the taggable type. And can anyone spot the mistake here? These 2 should be inverted. The taggable ID should be the integer, and the taggable type is the string. So in this case, the taggable types would be either meetups or talks. And in the code, this looks like this. So you have your Eloquent model with a simple belongs to relationship. So you say, okay, talk belongs to a meetup. And the not really much more complex polymorphic relationship, which says that a talk can have multiple tags. And the hint that you give to Laravel's ORM is that there's this taggable table in the middle. It's singular, but it will actually do the link between the 2. I think it's time for a first demo. So now I just have to remember how to switch screens. Okay. So here we have our web roots file. Here we have a terminal where I started the server, and we don't need it, so I'll hide it. And what we also have in this application that I did in advance, but because it's quite boring to watch me type all this code, is the table definitions in the form of a migration. So migrations, as opposed to what you could find in Django or other solutions, they're not linked to the model directly. Laravel has no way of inferring the set of migrations to apply to your database based on a definition. It's completely separate. So you will have, on the one hand, your models, and you have some code that generates the necessary tables. And here, there's nothing too impressive here. We create a talks table, a meetups table, some helpers. We saw earlier that we had this created at, updated at, timestamp field. It's such a common thing that you actually have to disable it by default, as you have to disable it in your models because it's enabled by default. What's not enabled by default is the soft deletes behavior. So the soft deletes is simply, if you look at the generated database, and the soft deletes is simply yet another yet another timestamp column that is null by default, and Laravel's ORM will handle all of this for you in your queries, and you would explicitly have to say that you want the deleted or trashed, to use the Laravel terms, that you want to include the trashed records in your requests. So, if we want to interact with this model, we could say, let's create these records from a root, but then you always have to switch back and forth between your web browser and your root definitions. But this could definitely work. So we create a talk. And we call the, oh nice, capture the flag URL that is still there. There we go, and here we have an error that we can debug in the right window. Okay, and here what we have, okay, we have a Laravel error. You'll see quite a lot of those in the, when you develop. Some are helpful. Some of them, not so much. They're more in the view part of Laravel when you work with blade templates. But in this case, it's actually quite a useful one. Here, it's once again Laravel helping you avoid common issues when using an ORM. And here, the error is a mass assignment error. It tells me that I actually filled a property using a table that could contain all sorts of data, such as, I don't know, is admin. In this case, it doesn't make sense, but let's imagine you're editing a users table. Well, here, without mass assignment protection, you could expose yourself to security issues. So, in this case, we have to explicitly go in the very lightweight model and say that you want the title attribute to be fillable. And here, title and talks. Oh, that's that's because I have to rerun my migrations. That's fine. There we go. And title of relation talks does not exist. Let's see, did I rename it? Probably renamed it to name. So I have this internal conflict with myself where I can never figure out whether I should use name or title. And here you just have an illustration of this. But that's fine. In the utilities that Laravel, that the migrator gives you, you have this command called migrate fresh, and it will do this really convenient thing of rolling back all your migrations, dropping all tables, rolling, well, you can do both. You can drop all tables and rerun everything, or you can start afresh like I did here. And in this case, if I renamed it title, let's see, and of course I'm not in the wrong, I'm editing the wrong one. There we go. Okay, there we go. Now we have our talk with the title, hello. So that's one way of interacting with it, but it's tedious to switch back and forth. And that's where the Tinker shell, which is based on side shell, does everyone, maybe not everyone is familiar with it. Basically, it's a REPL for PHP. It's nowhere as good as the one you'd find in languages such as Clojure, but it's the poor man's REPL, which gives you some ways of debugging a running application, even on production. So when you run Tinker, you actually start a side shell. And in this case, let's not do the same mistake, title. You talk. And it crashed. I had this after upgrading to a latest version. So let's just assume that this worked. I just did a PHP upgrade on my machine, and I think something crashed here. But in here, in the database, yeah, it just crashed without an error. OK, we'll skip that part. That's fine. That's the dangers of and the pleasure of doing live coding. So this is just simple ways of interacting with your database using Eloquent models. Unfortunately, the tinker command didn't work, but here you can see that by working from a root, you can easily create your database or query it. And we'll just do this. Of course. There we go. And you can enter more. You get the idea. And that's just the simplest possible way of interacting with an application. And I briefly talked about controllers and how you can use conventions to generate controllers and all the routes for a controller. Well, I'll quickly demo this since the Tinker demo didn't work. So open a terminal, PHP artisan make controller, talk controller, and let's just see in the help, I believe you can specify a model. Yeah, exactly. So model is talk controller. And we'll simply edit the show method to quickly demo what I talked about earlier. So here we have this talk that is automatically injected. We simply return it. And in the web roots definition file, we'll simply leave this here, and before it we'll say root resource. This is why normally there's a method called resource. Why is it not showing? Is it IntelliJ that is not? No, this is actually Laravel by default, even though I have this Laravel plugin installed, which is supposed to do some of the mapping. Actually, since these method calls are, they're not actually static method calls. They are static, but they're intercepted by something that Laravel calls facade. So here, the root class is actually a facade that intercepts the calls and dispatches it to the routing component of Laravel that can be, in theory, substituted. But that's not cool. I would like to have my autocomplete. So what the solutions you have, the main solution you have here is an IDE helper by our good friend Barry van der Helder, who is a name that you'll come across often in the Laravel community. Here we go. Because he developed all sorts of quality packages, and one of them is this IDE helper, which exposes a command called IDE helpers generate. There we go. I'll just have to wait for it to install. But this is something that I did on purpose, and that I'll come back to later in the things that I don't like about Laravel so much. It's, of course, I have an error in here. That's that wasn't expected, but that's simply because at the very end it tries to compile the roots, and there we go. And it found this, it tried to read this file, and it didn't, well, it crashed simply. Okay, so I've installed this package. I will go and install, well, define its service provider. Service providers, not this. Service providers are essentially classes that have some methods that define the behavior of an extension of Laravel at boot time, or they can be deferred. But once I've registered this, you have this new namespace that appeared called ID helper generate. There we go. And ta-da! Now we have, it's no longer yellow. Autocomplete, yes. Oh, what is it? Name string. Okay, great. Talk. And the controller is the talk controller. Just check that it registered it correctly. Yes. It's a little bit too large for this screen, but it's essentially what I showed you earlier in the screenshot. And the last point of the demo is just to show you this automatic resolution of, is it? There we go. This automatic resolution of the model. And all I had to do is say that I registered this controller and type hinted the model. And that's quite convenient, I find. It's quite cool. Back to the slides.
Just out of curiosity, I see that it marshals always all the fields. Is that, I imagine that's tunable because...
Of course, of course. So the question was, does it marshal all the fields by default? And of course, you can take two approaches. You can say that you want, actually the autocomplete here by default, to be fair, with Laravel works well without any extensions to the IDE. So you can have different attributes. The ones that you would use in this case is either the hidden one, where you say, okay, well, I don't want to show the updated at, and it will be gone from the JSON response. And you can also append if you have, well, you can do all sorts of things, and the documentation is quite good, but you can append computed properties. You can, there is also a very useful property called casts, where you define the how your model, when it's returned as JSON, how certain fields are cast. So, for instance, I think I could say ID. I'm not sure this will work. You could say that ID is a Boolean, and then it's true, and that gives you some flexibility when transforming data back and forth. Yeah, that's, any other questions about this part? So, since time flies, and how are we doing for time? How much time do I have left?
45 minutes.
Okay. How much time do I have left?
Already over time.
Come on, there was the intro. Okay. Okay, I'll speed up for the next parts, because I think the demo showed a lot of the topics I wanted to show later on. Another great part of Laravel is the collections, and the collections, they're simply a way of chaining your well, either working with arrays or Eloquent results, and chaining them with all sorts of methods. And this encourages a functional style of programming that is really cool, and that really helps your readability. And I have a book recommendation at the very end that shows you how to use Eloquent collections efficiently. Another great thing in Laravel, and that's what I was saying earlier, is that all packages have funky names, branded names, is the ecosystem of packages. So say you want to do a Stripe integration, you have this really cool package called Cashier, which does all which exposes a bunch of friendly methods to interact with that. You have Dusk for Chrome driver end-to-end testing. I've used it. It's okay. You might be better off with tools such as Cypress, but it's good to know that there is a sort of semi-official Laravel end-to-end testing solution. There's Lumen. Lumen is actually not just a package, it's a standalone framework, which is a lightweight version of Laravel, which you can look into if you really have to focus on performance and you don't want to load the entire framework. Passport for OAuth authentication and Socialite. So Passport is if you want to build an OAuth server. Having done it myself, it's quite tedious. Passport it's one dependency to add and a few things to configure, and you're up and running with a good OAuth 2 server. It's actually based on the PHP leaks package, so it's quite good. Socialite if you want to provide login with social providers. There's also a bunch of tools. The reason I'm listing them here is because it can be quite confusing when you land on the Laravel homepage to see, okay, what's an official package, what's a service, what's free, what isn't free. Well, most things, as you've seen, are free. The few paid products that actually support Taylor well and his team are Spark, which is a scaffolding for SaaS services, which really handles all the tricky bits of subscriptions, applying discounts, refunds, issuing invoices, all the things you waste time on. And I think it's quite well thought out and really lets you focus on the business problem that you're trying to solve rather than on the fundamentals. And there's also this new product that was released several months ago called Laravel Nova. And I'll quickly show you what it looks like in a later demo. And at the end of the presentation, there is actually a voucher code for 3 licenses, which are worth $99 each. There's also one of the nice packages that I've used in projects is Laravel Horizon, which lets you monitor queues. I think it's not the kind of functionality you often see in PHP applications, but queues are super helpful when you want to do any kind of background processing jobs, such as mailing, converting videos, and all that. And monitoring what's actually happening in your queue isn't always easy, and Laravel Horizon helps a lot with this. And in terms of using queues, so there are integrations with all the popular queuing tools, and there's also great support for Redis queues. And actually Laravel uses Redis for so many things. Redis can be used for caching, for queues, for pub sub. It's really integrated very well in Laravel, and you'll often, with more complex applications that have a real-time component, you'll often want to use Redis because it covers so many needs. And yes, Laravel Nova, and actually for time reasons, I'll show it at the very end in a final demo. Yeah. Sorry, great effect, but yeah, no demo here. There are also some services to provision servers and do zero downtime deployment that are provided by Laravel. They're good, they save you time, and they really hit that sweet spot for a side project, but for more serious ones, you'll often want to have more control over the environment there that your services are deployed in. But they're really saving you a lot of time. So you provision your server and you're guaranteed to have a fairly secure environment that has all the dependencies you need. And it works with DigitalOcean, AWS, and actually any kind of VPS running on Ubuntu. Some bad things. some things that I didn't like, and I think some people can chip in. It will take a bit longer, but if anyone wants to chip in at the end of this section, feel free to. So translations. I think it's really a shame to say this, but Laravel's translation mechanisms aren't present. They're there. You can localize an application, but it's not. You can tell that it's a framework that was developed in the US primarily for an English-speaking audience, and you wouldn't see this in Symfony or Rails, where the community was more diverse at the very start. I'm not saying that Laravel's community isn't diverse, far from that, but at the very beginning, the design decisions weren't taken with translations in mind. So translating UIs or models or URLs isn't trivial, and you manage your translations the official ways in big PHP arrays or a single JSON object which just acts as lookup, and there are some community solutions, but you can tell that they're not really integrated as closely with the framework, and you'll often have an impact on performance or maintainability of your routes or of your ORM, and that's a bit of a shame. So one of the things there are many. I know there isn't a single canonical way of doing internationalization. It's not an easy. It's not easy in most applications, but having the tools to manage, for instance, multiple fallbacks. So for instance, Laravel has only, the default language and the fallback language. Well, what do you do when you have a Swiss-French website where you have language and locale, so FRCH, which falls back to FR, and then to EN if nothing is present? That's not easy. That's far from trivial to do, having done it. It's the same for handling multiple strategies. So you don't have a way of, like you would in Rails, to say, okay, I want to look for my translation in the database. If it's not present, it really helps you shorten common structures in your PHP code, and it tells you a bunch of characters by using this at notation and then at end, actually at to end the tag. And you can really tell how it shortens your code, and in the end, your templates won't be that different from raw PHP, which isn't something you could say about Twig, for instance. And they've also, so if you're inside a loop, just like you would in Twig or Jinja or whatever, you could have useful information about the current loop iteration. So that's great too. You have a way of extending templates and all that. But you also have this it's improving, but it's still very hard to debug an issue inside a Blade template. And it's also tightly coupled with the framework. So one of the things we've tried and sort of failed to do is substitute the translation mechanism to include it in Blade. So you have this directive called trans, which calls the Laravel translator, but it can't be substituted easily. And this is the main gripe that I have with Blade, is that they took this at directive concept a little bit too far. Therefore, they've sort of broken any potential for functional composition and changing, the behavior or combining several directives. And that's a bit of a shame. You can avoid it mostly, but by default, Laravel will push you towards using more of those at directives, and they're not that great. This is a stack trace. I think it's improved slightly, but you have so since it's compiled, it has the hash of the file, you don't know exactly which template fragment broke, so it's not a great time. Those who've done some Laravel, especially in earlier versions, will know what I'm talking about. In recent versions, it seems to have improved, so perhaps it's not entirely valid. And the ugly, and I touched on this, by showing you the example of the ID helper. Well, it's that Laravel is developed by a stubborn developer who still chooses to use Sublime Text 2, I think. And he's that good. He has the entire framework in his head, but newcomers don't, and it makes it difficult to find out what part of the code is calling what other part, because he not only ignores those that use the one true way to develop applications. No, I'm joking. Those use an IDE that uses static code analysis. And PHP Storm and IntelliJ, they can't keep up with all of it. The IDE helper is sort of a band-aid on this problem, but still, it's such a shame. And having used recently, Kirby 3, which is based on PHP, which is similar in terms of complexity and which just works naturally. You can navigate your code back and forth without doing any extensions, and that's really something that I miss in Laravel. And hopefully the short demo I've made earlier has proven that. So dynamic methods, Laravel uses it in quite a few places. So for instance, in Eloquent, instead of doing queries where you say where some field value is equal to something, where there's actually a dynamic method, or a whole bunch of dynamic methods that can be combined to perform queries. And that's what we'll see. If you want to see what it looks like when you generate all possible methods, well, actually, for time reasons, we won't do that, but go look at what the IDE helper models command does and the amount of code that it has to generate. And it's nice. You certainly win in readability. The code looks nice, but you really lose in inspectability, and I think that's a major drawback for newcomers and experienced developers. In my experience, it's one of the biggest turnoffs for experienced senior PHP developers who are new to Laravel. And facades that I briefly touched on earlier, that's dispatch. Well, simply to have this short notation of root : get, well, it does all this dispatching behind the scenes, and yeah, that's not always easy to resolve for an IDE. And yeah, there's this recent comment on Reddit of some user who tried to find out everything that happened when you called a notification functionality in Laravel. And that's just a bunch of it's not just dynamic calls, it's also OOP, which has many shortcomings, and I think Laravel Nova, which we'll look at in the demo, has some of these issues as well. But don't expect it to be perfect. The reply from Taylor Otwell was simply, sorry, we're trying the best we can, or something like that, to this post. So, last demo. Let me just... Yeah. Last demo, and then we'll wrap up and continue with more drinks. So, in this last bit, I'll talk about Laravel Nova. Up until the release of Laravel Nova, there was no good official admin panel for Laravel. There are some community ones that are good as well, that were somewhat insufficient for some of our needs back in the days, but Nova was the official effort to address this, and it's I've mixed feelings about presenting you a paid component of Laravel, but at the same time it could be useful and save you a tremendous amount of time when you develop a backend to manage your data. So after installing it, you have this new folder called Nova. It's a bit small, which lets you define the entities, the resources, that you want to make editable in the backend. You define their fields, And that's where, once again, some kind of, here the object orientation, in my opinion, isn't ideal. You just have to chain a bunch of methods to define your field. In this case, we'll just look at what it looks like in the back end. No. So you have this admin interface, and we need to create a user. We have a bunch of commands registered in the Nova namespace. In this case, we want to create a new user. There we go. And log in again. And so we have this really nice admin panel with the various resources that are listed. From there, there's nothing exceptional, except that it's integrated really nicely with once again the name, the infamous name issue. Well, we'll have to do a poll at the end. People in favor of title or name or. Yeah, I've refreshed it. So title. So I'm editing meetups. I'm editing. Okay. So here we have name. Was it title? This will become the running joke for the evening. There we go. Okay, some other issue related to tags. So we'll just quickly create a new tag. A tag here, we some Laravel talk, and here we have an issue because of the demo code that I added here, which is respected by Laravel Nova. I'll just remove this. We don't need any typecasting here. We don't need any hidden fields. And there we go. And we still have an issue here with the polymorphic relationship. Taggable ID does not exist. Let's see. Of course. I was just playing with some shortcuts here. So the query builder, the schema migrator has some useful utilities for the schema shapes that you often use. In this case, we have this morphs method, which actually by default creates those two tables. And here, well, let's just do it the old school way. Migrate fresh. It's actually going to use, it's going to wipe the entire database. So obviously you wouldn't want to use this fresh command every time. Create a talk. There we go. And then you associate it with a new tag. And okay, forget it. Once again, this title name issue, you've seen it enough times tonight. So one of the slightly tedious things that I found about Nova is the fact that you're basically duplicating the definitions of your objects in three places. The first place being the talks, the migrations, where you create the talks table. You scatter some more logic in the Eloquent model itself, and then in Nova, which comes on top of it and then wraps it, you once again define some more. And I know it helps decouple it, and it lets Eloquent work as a standalone package, but it would be nice to have some common way of defining this, perhaps in a more functional way, in a more config style, declarative way, rather than just chaining methods and making, well, silly mistakes like title, which is named title in one place and name in two other places. So that's Laravel Nova. I've hardly scratched the surface of this. I could give an entire talk about this, but there are some great ways of filtering and displaying your data, and highly encourage you to play with it. And the winner of the quiz will actually get 3 licenses to run this legally on their project. Okay, wrapping up. So, should you use Laravel? Obviously, yes, I think you'll probably be fine with Laravel. You'll save time in the learning process. There are, well, great books, documentation, video tutorials about it. You'll save a lot of time developing using Artisan, the shell, the generators. You'll save time thanks to the ORM, to the various conventions available in the framework, and also, well, shipping it. Because very often, well, there are 2 kinds of developers. Rather, there are those that would rather just focus on the business logic and solving a real problem and earning a living, and those that want to configure every last part of the framework and their server stack. And perhaps for those, Laravel isn't ideal, but for those that really want to ship things and validate ideas and iterate upon them, and that are fine with some of the irritating aspects of the framework, I would highly recommend it. I would strongly advise you not to replace any core parts of the framework. Really don't try to do it. Don't try to replace the routing. Views, you could use Twig, but once again, it's not integrated really well. The ORM, not really either. You could introduce Doctrine and have separate repositories that call Eloquent models and have various strategies for data that is fetched else from another source. But I wouldn't recommend it, and you'll mostly be fine with Eloquent. I would recommend to use the framework utilities sparingly, so everything that's a facade, so DB something or string something. Try to isolate it and write your business logic in plain PHP. It sounds like obvious advice, but Laravel makes it relatively easy to just call and inject a few classes that are framework agnostic into a Laravel application. Some learning resources to conclude. The one I've been recommending to most people is Laracast. Does anyone know about Laracast, or has anyone watched them? Yeah. So it's definitely a great investment. There's some really quality content on there on Laravel, Vue, and how to use PHP Storm better. If I had one resource to recommend, it would be Laracast. There are also some great books. Laravel Up and Running, the 2nd edition came out not too long ago, and this book called Refactoring to Collections, which isn't specific to Laravel, and which is really great in showing you how to think in a more functional approach and how to work with collections and apply small bits of logic to a collection rather than do it in a way that mutates some global variable. We're at the end of it. Thank you.